Nobody on the ward noticed the quiet nurse, Anna Walker, and she liked it that way. For 3 days, she'd insisted. Alone. That something worse than a tantrum was happening to the 8-year-old boy in room 4. For 3 days, they'd called her an alarmist. Then, a desperate father locked the room from the inside, and stopped answering anyone at all. In the end, it wasn't a guard, or a police officer who opened that door. It was a voice. The voice of someone who knew how to talk to people standing at the edge. When what was on the line wasn't a discharge form, but a life. Before we start, if you're into stories about quiet people with a hidden past, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Now, from the beginning. Like you don't know any of this yet. Cedar Grove Medical Center had stood on the edge of town for 40 years. And the rain had been falling for 3 straight days. Steady. Without a break. Like the sky was trying to prove something. Anna Walker worked a double shift in pediatrics, and none of her co-workers could remember her ever raising her voice. 34 years old, light brown hair pulled into a low ponytail. A gaze that always found the floor. Half a second before it found anyone's eyes. She wore the most uncomfortable shoes on the ward, because the comfortable ones ran a size too small and pinched. And nobody had ever once heard her complain about that either. She showed up 10 minutes before everyone else, and left 15 minutes after. She remembered the names of every parent on the floor, and never once mentioned where she lived. She had one habit at the nurse's station that people noticed, but never brought up. She always sat facing the door. Always. Even at lunch. Even when everyone else sat with their backs to the window. The patients adored her. Kids asked for her by name when it was time for an IV. Because she could talk them through the needle so smoothly, they barely felt it. Parents remembered her name, and mailed her Christmas cards. Her coworkers, in 3 years, had never once invited her to a Friday happy hour, not out of malice, but because she never stayed after a shift. Never complained. Never gave anyone a reason to remember her. Being forgettable was safer than being seen. She'd learned that rule long before Cedar Grove. A week before the incident with Timmy. Something crashed in the hallway. A heavy metal tray slipping out of an orderly's hands, hitting the floor like a gunshot. 3 nurses flinched. An intern dropped his pen. Anna didn't flinch at all. Her eyes cut to the door. Then the window. And only then to the tray, and she went right back to the IV bag in her hands, like nothing had happened. Dwayne, mopping up the mess, watched her a second too long. Military? He asked, not really expecting an answer. Long time ago, Anna said, and went back to the IV bag. Neither of them said another word about it. Mia, standing next to her, later told her friends that Nurse Walker didn't seem to know how to be scared. That wasn't quite right. She knew how to be scared. Her fear just looked like a quick check of the exits. That was all. Room 4 held Timothy Coleman, 8 years old, on his 3rd day under observation. He drew helicopters, plain kid scribbles, but always the same one. Over and over. Like it was the one thing he could control, in a room where the adults decided everything for him. He'd come in with stomach pain that got called gastritis first. Then stress. Then, on morning rounds, just a kid being dramatic. His father, David Coleman, a welder with weathered hands, hadn't left the bedside since the first night. He'd been raising Timmy alone for 2 years, since his wife left. Unable to handle his shift work and his silences, and since then, the boy had been the one truly steady thing in his life. David slept 2 hours a night in the chair, and by the 4th day, he was mixing up the nurses' names, apologizing, mixing them up again. He called his foreman every day, explaining he'd need 1 more shift off, then 1 more, and heard the silence on the other end of the line get shorter every time. Anna checked on Timmy every hour, though the chart only called for every 4. She never said so out loud. She just came by more. On the pretext of an IV. On the pretext of changing the sheets. On any pretext that didn't require an explanation to her coworkers. At 6 in the morning, she laid her palm on the boy's stomach, and he moaned before she'd even pressed down. His abdomen was rigid, not just tense, bored hard. Right side, lower quadrant. She pulled out a penlight, checked his pupils, counted his pulse. 122. For an 8-year-old at rest, too high. She wrote the numbers down in the chart, in careful, legible handwriting, and underlined them twice. Dr. Prescott showed up at 7:15, flanked by 2 residents and a young nurse named Mia, holding a cup of coffee like it was part of his title. Nathan Prescott had run the department for 11 years, and in 5 months, he was set to take the chair of the entire pediatric wing, if the board didn't find a reason to change its mind. He'd spent 3 years preparing for that vote, 2 papers at the national conference, a spotless discharge record, not one formal complaint filed against him in his entire tenure. He didn't like reasons to doubt himself, because he'd put more into that chair than he was willing to admit, even to his own wife. He liked things predictable, and Anna Walker, with her constant buts, was the one unpredictable thing in his schedule. Rigid abdominal wall. Tachycardia at 122. Positive rebound tenderness, Anna said, holding out the chart. Worse since yesterday. Prescott didn't take it. Nurse Walker's diagnosing again, he said, turning to the residents, like it was a line worth writing down for a future lecture. The kid's got anxiety, and an overprotective father who's slept in this room for 4 nights straight, and is feeding his own panic into his son. This isn't medicine, it's psychosomatic. Give him another dose of lorazepam, and leave the family alone. Mia giggled, not loud, but loud enough for Anna to hear. One of the residents smirked along. The other one just looked at the floor, the same spot Anna usually looked at. His stomach's hard as a rock, doctor. 8-year-olds get hard stomachs when they've been crying for 2 days straight, Prescott said. You're a nurse, not a surgeon, Nurse Walker. Write down what I tell you, not what you think matters. Anna didn't answer. She wrote the order. Her hand didn't shake. Later that same day, a code went off in the next room. A cardiac arrest in an elderly patient whose pacemaker had failed without warning. The hallway filled with shouting, carts, metal clanging against metal. Mia, standing next to Anna, dropped a tray of syringes and couldn't pick it back up. Her hands were shaking too hard, and she froze, staring at the glass shards at her feet. Anna calmly swept them into the sharps container, while the code team worked 3 feet away, charging the defibrillator a second time. Anna's pulse, if anyone had bothered to check, would have come back unchanged. Dwayne, the orderly on shift, a heavy-set man pushing 60 who'd worked at Cedar Grove longer than any doctor currently on staff, watched her through the glass, and said nothing. He just looked a second longer than he needed to, and there was something in that look that resembled recognition. She didn't know anyone had noticed. By evening, Timmy was worse. He'd stopped crying, not because it hurt less, but because there was nothing left in him. He lay still, eyes half open, breath fast and shallow. The helicopter drawing left unfinished on the paper. The pencil rolled off his hand onto the blanket. Anna called Prescott again. Temps up to 103. Bored, rigid abdomen. He's barely responding to exam. He's asleep, Prescott said, not looking up from his tablet. Kids sleep when the tantrum's over. We discharge tomorrow. And I'll personally talk to the father about getting the whole family into counseling. He needs a surgeon. Doctor. Prescott finally looked at her. The look you give a chair. That's overdue for the dumpster. Nurse Walker. This is the 3rd time this shift you've questioned my judgment in front of staff. One more, and I file a formal complaint with our, and we discuss whether you have a future on this floor. Understood? Yes, doctor. She walked back to the station, took a pen, and wrote her disagreement into the chart, dry, unemotional, in the same handwriting she used for everything else. Dwayne, passing by with his cart, stopped just long enough to say one thing. Quiet, almost to himself, but loud enough for her to hear. "You've seen how it ends when nobody listens, haven't you, Nurse Walker?" She didn't ask how he knew. Some questions are more dangerous than the answers. That afternoon, Prescott brought a group of 6 new residents through on rounds, an event he always turned into a small performance. He stopped at the nurse's station, swept his eyes over the interns, and nodded toward Anna. "Good example for the future," he said, not lowering his voice. "Nurse Walker's an excellent hand with an IV, and a catastrophic diagnostician. Remember the difference between caretaking and practicing medicine, because she seems to have forgotten it around Tuesday." The 6 residents laughed, some louder, some out of politeness. Anna stood there with a chart in her hands, and didn't look up. "One more time you second-guess my diagnosis in front of patients," Prescott added, turning to face her square on, "and I file a disciplinary report. That's your final warning, Nurse Walker." She nodded, wrote the time in her notepad. Not a single muscle in her face moved. But that evening, once the floor cleared out, she checked on Timmy herself. Without authorization, for the 4th time in 2 hours. She worked the rest of the shift straight through. Made her rounds on 6 more patients, changed 3 IV bags. Never once sat down. At 10:30, she handed off to the night nurse, but she didn't drive home. The rain had turned the road out to her place into a wash, and she wasn't risking it half asleep in a storm like this. She stayed in the break room instead, meaning to finish her charting and catch an hour on the ugly couch before her next shift. She looked in on room 4 one last time. Timmy was sleeping fitfully, breath quick. David sat beside him, head in his hands, and didn't look up when she came in. She didn't disturb him. She just straightened the blanket over the boy's shoulder, and left as quietly as she'd come. That same evening, David Coleman stepped out for coffee, and stopped outside the half-open door of the doctor's lounge. He heard the word, psychosomatic, heard Prescott call him, not the boy, him, a textbook anxious father, winding himself up, and winding up the staff along with him. Heard the residents laugh. He went back to the room, sat down beside his son, and didn't say another word to anyone. For the rest of the night brought the worst of it. By 11, Timmy's fever had climbed to 104. His blood pressure was dropping, and his fingertips had gone gray. David, on his 4th sleepless night, sat frozen, holding his son's hand. When Mia came in for a routine blood pressure check, he looked at her in a way that sent her out of the room without finishing. At 2 in the morning, David Coleman locked room 4's door from the inside, dragged a chair against it, and sat down beside his son. When a nurse knocked for a follow-up check, he didn't answer. When they knocked again, louder, he shouted through the door that nobody was touching his son again, until somebody actually listened to him, instead of discharging him with an apology for the trouble and a referral to a therapist. The shouting woke Anna in the break room. She came out into the hallway in a rumpled uniform, still half asleep, and understood at once. The quiet part of the night was over. Something else had started. The floor went still. Prescott, called back from home, stood at the door in a jacket thrown on in a hurry, repeating the same thing over and over. "Please, just open the door. We only want to make sure everything's all right." His voice shook worse than the father's did behind it. The security guard on duty called it in under barricade protocol, with a minor inside. 2 orderlies searched for a spare key. The only one was locked in the day administrator's safe, and the administrator had left an hour ago, and wasn't picking up. Residents crowded at the end of the hall, filming on their phones on the sly. Mia stood against the wall with a hand over her mouth, not smiling at anything, for the first time all shift. Anna stood off to one side, by the station, listening to the boys breathing through the door. Not the fathers shouting, not the security negotiations, just the breathing. Short, quick breaths, with a faint whistle on the exhale. She'd heard that before, in another life. He's not breathing right, she said out loud, to no one in particular. David has no idea what's happening to his son right now, sitting right next to him. Nobody heard her. Everyone was focused on the door. Prescott kept knocking and pleading, and his voice fell apart a little more with every try. He kept repeating the word, protocol, like it might unlock the door on its own. One of the residents suggested calling a psychiatrist. Another suggested calling the hospital's lawyer, in case of a lawsuit, before anyone even knew if the child inside was still alive. Police arrived 12 minutes later, too fast for a small town department, and far too slow for what was happening behind the door of room 4. The officer on duty, a young man named Hoskins, fresh off a 2-week negotiation course he'd never once used outside a classroom, planted himself at the door and started reading off the script. David, we're here to help. Nobody gets hurt if you open the door. The voice was right. The words were right. None of it worked. Hoskins glanced back at the security supervisor for a cue, but the man just shrugged. There was no line in his job description for fathers barricading themselves with sick kids. Hoskins tried again. Louder. More insistent. And it only made things worse. David heard the same impatience in his voice that he'd heard in Prescott's for 3 straight days. David shouted back through the door that he'd begged them to listen for 3 days and been called hysterical. And now it was his turn not to listen to anyone. Timmy moaned, quiet, brief, and the sound cut through the door and through the crowd in the hallway, faster than any negotiator's line ever could. Prescott stood against the wall. His hands were shaking, for real this time, not for show. The tablet he'd carried for 11 years like an extension of his own arm slipped and hit the floor, and he didn't bend down to pick it up. One resident murmured to another that the doctor looked, for the first time in his whole career, like a man who had no idea what to do next. Nobody laughed this time. Anna moved to the hallway window, where she had an angled view of the door. She did what she always did when chaos broke loose around her. She counted. 1 exit at the end of the hall. A second, through the stairwell behind the nurse's station. A fire extinguisher on the wall, 10 feet from the door. David Coleman, judging by his voice, was standing with his back to the window, not the door. The classic mistake of a man more afraid of what's outside than what's happening inside. Hoskins kept reading from the script. David hadn't answered in 90 seconds. 90 seconds of silence. Behind a door where an 8-year-old was breathing the way an 8-year-old should never breathe. Weighed more than every protocol the hospital owned. By then, the rooms nearby had been cleared into the waiting area at the end of the wing. Parents held their kids and tried to explain what was happening, without finding words that wouldn't scare them worse. An elderly woman from room 6, whose grandson had a broken arm, clutched her rosary and prayed out loud, not caring who heard. All of them looked toward room 4, and at the quiet nurse by the window, the only one in the hallway, who didn't look lost. Anna stood at the window a moment longer than she needed to. She took one breath, low and slow, the kind she hadn't had to take in years. Then, she walked up to the door. She didn't ask permission, she just stepped in next to Hoskins, and spoke, quiet and level, into the gap between the door and the frame. David. My name's Anna. I'm the nurse who told the doctor, you were right about Timmy. I'm not going to ask you to open the door. Just tell me how he's breathing right now. A pause. Long. Then a voice, cracked, shaking, fast. Too fast. And he's not opening his eyes when I call him. I'm glad you told me that. Instead of staying quiet, Anna answered. Her voice didn't shift a half tone. You're doing the most important thing a father can do for him right now. You're there. I want to stay right here with you through this door, until we figure out what to do next. Okay? Hoskins tried to cut in behind her. Ma'am, this isn't your role. But Prescott, still against the wall, said nothing. For the first time all shift. David didn't answer right away. Then he said one word, okay. Behind her, Prescott finally found his voice and tried to step in. Nurse Walker. Step away from the door. This isn't your job. You're jeopardizing the whole operation. What operation, doctor? Anna said, without turning around. So far, nobody's done anything but knock and beg. Hoskins, to his credit, didn't argue. He looked at Prescott's shaking hands, his pale face, the tablet lying on the floor, and quietly stepped half a pace back, clearing space at the door. Anna kept going, quiet, measured, without a wasted word. She never asked yes or no questions. She reflected back what she heard, rephrased just enough, like a mirror. When David said everyone in this hospital lied, she didn't argue. She said, they lied to you for 3 days. And you're tired of not being believed. The pause behind the door stretched out, not from anger, but because for the first time in 3 days, someone had said out loud what he actually felt. How would you know what this feels like? He said. Hollow. I don't know what it's like to be your son, she answered. But I know what it's like to tell the truth to someone who's supposed to hear you, and watch them look right through you instead. I do it every day on this floor. David, they called me an alarmist this morning, too. The silence behind the door changed. Not softer, more attentive. Is Timmy still holding your hand? She asked. Yes. Good. Don't let go. And tell me what happened, the last time you called his name. He opened his eyes for a second, then closed them again. That matters. David, it means he can hear you. It means there's still time. I need you to help me buy him a few more minutes, not by opening the door, just by talking to me. Down the hall, there was movement. A second patrol car had pulled in. 2 more officers stepped out of the elevator in tactical gear. And Hoskins stepped back, making room for a team leader nobody could see yet, but whose voice was already coming through the radio on his belt. Prescott went paler at the sight of the gear, as if the presence of actual specialists made his own paralysis that much more obvious to everyone standing in the hall. The radio on Hoskins' belt crackled before Anna could get out her next line. The rapid response team was arriving, the police department's negotiation unit, called in under barricade protocol with a minor involved. Dispatch announced the team leader's call sign for coordination with the officer on scene. Hoskins held the radio up to the door, trying to sync what Anna was saying with what department procedure demanded. Post. This is Hound 1. Team lead Captain Boyd. 1 minute out. Who's currently engaging the subject? Hoskins, not sure what else to do, held the radio out toward Anna. Anna took it, without thinking. The way you pick up something you've held 1,000 times before. And she spoke into it, short and matter of fact, in a language nobody teaches civilian nurses. Distance to subject. Position relative to the window. No weapon. A minor with a deteriorating physical status. There was a pause on the other end, 2 seconds longer than protocol allowed. Post. That phrasing, control distance. No direct visual, that's not civilian training. Identify yourself. Anna closed her eyes for a second, opened them. Nightingale, she said, former call sign, haven't used it in a long time. Here is the dramatic conclusion of the story, fully formatted and optimized for English TTS voiceover narration. The hallway went as quiet as it had been loud all night. The residents lowered their phones. Prescott slowly turned his head. Hoskins froze with his mouth open. Nightingale, the voice on the radio repeated. And something came into it that protocol never allows for. Keep working the subject. We're 2 minutes out. The whole team answers to you until we're on scene. That's an order. Hoskins stared at the radio, then at Anna, like she'd started speaking another language. In a way, she had. The residents by the station froze. One of them would later admit to a coworker that in that second, it felt like the whole hospital had shifted an inch and settled somewhere else. She didn't explain any of it. There was no time. "David," she said again through the door. Calm, like nothing had happened. "I need you to do one thing for Timmy right now, without opening the door. Put your hand on his stomach and tell me, is it hard or soft?" A pause. A shuffle. A voice, cracking with fear. "Hard. Like a rock." Anna turned to face Prescott. For the first time all night, straight on, no lowered eyes. "He has a ruptured appendix and peritonitis. Dr. Prescott. Not anxiety. Not psychosomatic. This boy has an abdominal infection. And if we don't get through that door in the next few minutes, he's going to die of sepsis in the room you've been calling a tantrum all day." Prescott opened his mouth, found nothing to say. "David," Anna said through the door. "I've been in places where people had to make decisions in seconds, when it felt like the whole world was against them. Your son needs an operating room right now, not a locked door. Open it, not for the hospital. Open it for him. I promise you I'll walk in first. And I will be right beside him from this second on, and I am not leaving, no matter what happens next." The lock clicked almost immediately. The door opened a hand's width. David Coleman stood inside. Pale, hands shaking, but alive, lucid, waiting. Anna went in first. Dropped to one knee by the bed, fingers on the boy's wrist. Thready pulse. 140. Pressure 80/50. Mottled skin. Positive rebound tenderness, she said over her shoulder. In the same level voice. Fitting an oxygen mask over the boy's face. Septic shock. Ruptured appendix with diffuse peritonitis. 2 peripheral lines. Saline bolus. Rapid response and a surgeon to this room now. Cancel the CT. Get him to the OR right now. There's no time for imaging. Prescott, for the first time that shift, didn't argue. He called the team himself, in his own voice. Shaking but functional. And this time, every word out of him was useful. At that moment, Captain Boyd stepped out of the elevator at the end of the hall. A big man pushing 50. In a uniform jacket. Radio lowered once he saw the door was already open. He walked past the crowd of residents straight to Anna, who was helping shift Timmy onto a gurney, and stopped where the whole hallway could hear him. "Lieutenant Walker," he said, loud and clear, looking at Prescott and everyone standing near him. "Hostage negotiation instructor. 3 years of service. 7 successful resolutions without a single casualty. Put up for a commendation she turned down herself. I thought we'd lost the best negotiator in the unit when she left. Turns out she just found another job, saving people nobody bothers to listen to." The residents went silent. Mia, hand over her mouth, looked at Anna like she was seeing her for the first time in 3 years of shared shifts. Prescott stood against the wall, looking at the woman he'd called an alarmist, and found nothing to say. At the end of the hall, by the linen cart, Dwayne stood watching. He was the only one who didn't look surprised. He just nodded to himself. Like a checkmark he'd been carrying for 3 years had finally landed where it belonged. And went back to work without waiting for anyone to notice. Anna's hands, steady through all of it, started shaking the second the gurney disappeared through the OR doors. She pressed them flat against the wall until they stopped. Alone. Before anyone rounded the corner to see. As they wheeled the gurney toward the OR, Prescott walked alongside, holding the IV line, giving orders sharp and useful for the first time that shift, calling anesthesia directly instead of through dispatch, warning the OR about unstable hemodynamics, buckling the gurney strap himself when the orderly's hands slipped. Timothy Coleman was in surgery for 40 minutes. The surgeon would say later that if they'd waited another hour, The conversation wouldn't have been about recovery, it would have been about a funeral. The peritonitis had spread, but it hadn't gone past the point of no return. The boy lived. David Coleman sat through the whole surgery in the hallway, gripping a chair until his knuckles went white. And when the surgeon came out with the news that everything had gone well, he cried the way he hadn't cried in 3 days. Not out of despair, but because the despair was finally over. He found Anna at the station and tried to say something and couldn't, and just squeezed her hand between both of his. And she let him, without pulling away, without rushing him. Timmy spent 2 days in recovery and 5 more in the regular ward, the same room, room 4. On the 3rd day after surgery, he asked for paper and a pencil and drew a helicopter again, finished this time. Rotors and all. A tiny figure in the cockpit. He handed the drawing to Anna without a word, and she pinned it to the wall at the nurse's station, where it stayed for months after he went home. "You saved him," David told her on discharge day, standing in the doorway with his son's backpack in his hands. "The surgical team saved him," Anna answered. "I just helped you get that door open in time." He shook his head, but didn't argue. The board vote for the head of pediatrics got pulled with no explanation offered out loud. On his last day as department head, Prescott found Anna at the nurse's station. "The potassium wasn't late," he said quietly. "I saw the warning signs in his stomach back on Tuesday. I called it hysteria, because it was easier than admitting I hadn't caught it the first time." He walked away without waiting for an answer. Anna knew from experience. People rarely tell the truth twice. Say it once, and if nobody calls them out for it in public, that's usually enough to live with it after. 2 months later, Prescott transferred to another hospital as a staff physician with no department to run, and before he left, he personally pushed for a review of 3 other cases from the past year where a diagnosis had been rushed. 2 out of 3 turned out to be wrong. Mia came to find her that same day. She didn't try to excuse the giggling at the station. She just asked if she could sign up for extra training on evaluating abdominal pain in kids. Anna nodded. "Start by listening to the nurses around you too, even when they're quiet." A month later, Cedar Grove adopted a new rule. 2 written objections from a nurse against a doctor's order in the same shift triggered an automatic second opinion before the treatment plan could be finalized. Dwayne, it turned out much later, had spent his whole working life in the military police. He was the only one on the floor who'd recognized, from day one, how someone sits when they're used to keeping a door in view, and he never told anyone how he knew. Captain Boyd came by once more, with paperwork for a commendation she turned down for the 2nd time in her life. Anna Walker turned down the local paper's interview request too, and the plaque the administration wanted to hang by the entrance. She came back for her next shift in the same uncomfortable shoes, and went right back to being the one almost nobody noticed in the hallway. She still sat facing the door. Only Dwayne, passing by with his cart, would nod at her a beat longer than he needed to. This story wasn't written about war, or about medicine. It's about how easily we mistake a quiet person's silence for the absence of a problem, and how long we'll call a warning hysteria, rather than admit someone quieter than us was right. Prescott wasn't a monster. He was a man who found it easier to believe in his own competence than in someone else's judgment, and it nearly cost a child his life. It happens far beyond hospitals, at any staff meeting where someone raises a risk quietly a second time, and gets labeled a worrier. Because admitting they're right means admitting your own mistake. Ask yourself, who has already tried to warn you twice, and you decided, the last time, to call them dramatic instead?